So La Centrale is an artist training center dedicated to the dissemination and development of multidisciplinary feminist artistic practices, and we develop programming that engages with feminism and supports intersectionality and social justice. Before going any further, I would like to acknowledge that La Centrale Guelph is located on unceded indigenous land, Kijake. We also recognize the Ganan-Gaga nation as a custodian of the land and water on which we gather today. We respect the continuous connection with the past, future, and present in our ongoing relationship with indigenous and other people within the Montreal community. We want this talk to be as safe as possible, so we do not tolerate inappropriate comments, and we reserve the right to exclude any person whose behavior is deemed problematic by the Centrale, by the artist, by any other participants. And just a few rules regarding the COVID regulation. We're going to ask you to keep your mask during the whole duration of the talk and be aware of social distancing. And also, if you could please turn off your phone, just because we are recording. And so, thank you again for being here for this talk. And we are very grateful and excited to have Shirin Fahimi and Vince Rozario here at La Centrale. And La Centrale, Articule, and the Art Gallery of Guelph are pleased to present the first of Precarious City Dwellers, conversation of the science of scent with Shirin Fahimi and Vince Rozario. So this event is presented in conjunction with the exhibition Dot by Dot Like a Baby Gazelle here at the Centrale, curated by Mitra Fakhrashrafi from Ilm-al-Raml Scent Narrative Soul Exhibition by artist Shirin Fahimi at Articule, and the exhibition Collective of Remain curated by Mitra Fakhrashrafi and Vince Rozario at the Art Gallery of Guelph. So, Dot by Dot Like a Baby Gazelle draws on tattoo culture from across Iran and the Maghreb as an entry point to explore nation building, gender, diaspora, and the future, especially other futures, which demands the rejection of binaries, static histories, and erasure. Thank you. I'm going to let Mika from Articule say a few words now.
Hello, so my name is Mikael. I use her, she pronouns, and I'm the programming coordinator at Articule. I'm just going to talk briefly about Articule as well. So Articule is an open access artist-run center dedicated to the presentation of broad range and contemporary art practices. Through our various programming channels, we strive for artistic experience, interdisciplinarity, and social engagement. While special consideration is given to emerging artists, we also respect those who have already established important precedents, but who continue to test the limits of aesthetic gesture and who commit themselves to the ideals of experimentation and risk-taking. I'm not going to take too much space since we already took a lot of space and we have a beautiful introduction from Julia, but just as she mentioned before, we have the exhibition Ilm-al-Raml Narratives at Montreal at Articule. And we're in our new space, not in Fairmount anymore, just to make sure that everyone goes to the right space. We're on Centrale now, so thank you.
Thank you. And just to introduce myself, my name is Vince Rozario. I'm a curator, an art critic, and a community organizer. I've had the very good fortune of working with Shirin for a little over a year, in the past year, on an exhibition, Collective Offerings, at the Art Gallery of Guelph, in collaboration with my co-curator, Mitra Fakhrashrafi, who wasn't able to make it today. But yeah, I just wanted to extend my thanks to La Centrale, Articule, and the Art Gallery of Guelph for making this talk happen, and also to Shirin, Nima, the entire AGG team, and to Mitra, who's really stewarded this exhibition and our sort of collaborative practice with a lot of love, a lot of care, and a lot of time. So Shirin, you and I have known each other for a few years. I think we met when Nima invited me to do a talk at Concordia many years ago. And I was always aware of your practice around divination and how you were sort of integrating it into your art making. But really, we've kind of intensively been in contact for the last year or so. So I don't know if you'd like to introduce your practice and what you do a little bit.
So I'm Shirin Fahimi, so happy for you come here. Thank you so much. So I'm a digital-based artist. Since 2019, actually, I moved towards using digital technology. Before that, it was more performance. We see it here, actually, the iteration of it. and I work with talisman and divination since 2016. And I'm based in Ontario, a suburb, Aurora. If you don't know, it's like 2 hours away from Toronto, and very isolated in my room. But I had a chance to be in Banff Center prior to here, which was amazing, and here now.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we wanted to explain a little bit about our choice of title for today's talk, The Craft of Precarious City Dwellers. It's actually from a passage from Al-Muqaddimah by Ibn Khaldun, which is like a 14th century historical text, and he talks about these practitioners in Baghdad who were practicing geomancy, whom he regarded with some suspicion, basically. A lot of them were just kind of regular townspeople rather than clerics or mystics, and were sort of charging money for it, and he found it to be a somewhat questionable practice. And he sort of explained it away in a way by saying that because these city dwellers lacked knowledge of complex mathematics to understand astronomical calculations, that they instead drew marks on the ground in order to orient themselves and ground themselves. And that's something that I personally found very compelling in the work that Shirin created for our show at the Art Gallery of Guelph in the House of Fire with Avaz-e Eshq, where in one of the videos this passage comes up. And in the context of that show, where we were looking at methodologies for finding ways to reconnect after kind of the cumulative weight of catastrophes on various marginalized communities. And it was about finding systems of knowledge that might otherwise be deprivileged or discarded and reclaiming them in some ways to make sense of kind of cataclysm, uncertainty, and adversity, essentially. So that's kind of, I guess, where we're approaching the topic of Ramli today in Shirin's practice. And I wonder if, Shirin, you want to sort of introduce Ramli as a practice and its history a little bit.
Yeah, so the divination methodology I use, it has different names. In Iran, we call it Ramali, which it means sand. Raml means sand in Arabic, but still we use it as Ramal, person who do it, or Ramali, the act of it. In Arabic sense, it has Ilm-al-Raml, science of sand, or Ilm-al-Khat, science of lines. So it has different titles to it, and in English they translated to geomancy as well. So it went to Christianity as well. But one point that was interesting for me was what is the origin of this divination? And there are multiple stories about origin stories. There are origin stories that Prophet Idris, Gabriel appeared to Prophet Idris, put his 4 fingers on the sand, showed him the reading of divination with 4 dots on the sand, and it's like very mystic. And there are Ibn Khaldun, who said, oh, people who didn't have access to technology to read the stars, they start creating these random, not random with intention, but on the ground, but they make the patterns rather than look and read the sky. So there are different ways of access point. What's the origin of it? And interestingly, it's very shared geographically. West Africa, they call it Ifa. It's very similar to Ifa. It's very similar to I Ching, sorry if my pronunciation wrong, in China, or even Feng Shui is as well as some sort of a terrestrial understanding of energies with Earth itself. So it's shared differently in different geographies. And they call it differently, and each has a mystical story about it. And in the books that I found like 3 different stories how this comes. Is it Prophet Adam? Is it Adam? Is it Idris? Is it Daniel? And that gives me a space to make my own original story about it and possibilities of like creating an original story. It's very binary code based, algorithmic. I was reading about the tablet in British Museum kept. In the footnote, it described how to use it, and for me it was clicking like, wow, I now know how to use it because it's very algorithm, it's very binary code based. So the systematic of it made it accessible for me, but how you define each figure, it depends who is doing a divination. So again, it gives me an access to use the knowledge of women around me to interpret them. And then the last part I want to say is about gender bias as well in it, that you face, like how in Iran, if you Google a woman divinator or zane ramal, it comes up so many articles like a woman darkens someone else's life because of this, or like it's very derogatory, and especially when women use it, they become devil or naive or superstitious. But when men kind of use it, they become wise. You know, it's always a gender bias, which I through the anthropologist Ali Reza Dostar. I was reading his book. He went to Iran and explored that more in depth with interviews. And it becomes interesting for me, the gender bias as well, how women are being seen. They become very a derogatory term. When you in Iran, we commonly know if someone is Ramal, they're charlatan. And it took me a while to understand this is actually a science behind it, and it's very systematic. They use it in court. It was sort of an algorithm. Before you know the person, they do a letterism and divination in order to make a decision prior to actually see what was doing, who was doing what. So the whole algorithm of it was interesting for me, a connection between celestial and terrestrial.
Right. One thing that came up a lot in our conversations is that this is a way of interpreting time through matter, right, through material practices. But also, it's a way of situating time within embodied methodologies, right? And that's where I think the question of feminine prophecy or women prophets becomes so important, right? A lot of the kind of iterations of this practice that you have involve you spending a lot of time engaging in divination with these different women who practice Ramali, and also of finding kind of different modes of accessing it as a practice, because it's not a monolithic thing. And so I kind of wanted to ask again, like, I know you went into it a little bit about the gender bias here in terms of women practicing this, but why the central question of a woman prophet, and why this figure of Ilm-al-Raml?
I mean, growing up in Iran, being in a religious sort of country, and from the school, and not necessarily from the family, but from school, you used to, I mean, I remember 7 years old, like, being obsessed with Prophet's story, Prophet Solomon talking to a bird, or there is a fire appearing, you hear God. So inevitably you feel connected, and you believe and imagine this word in your head as a childhood. And I was always afraid of hearing God. I say, come on, I don't want to be responsible for anyone. Don't call me. And then, but it was... And I remember my grandmother loved my brother so much, and he always said, "You're such a prophet." But then she never told me I'm such a prophet. And eventually you realize, you're called angel, you're not prophet. And I read more about it. Like in Iran, actually, there is a two term for prophecy: Nabi and Rasul. Nabi is the person who received revelation, and they say, oh, bees can receive revelation, so of course women can receive revelation. But Rasul is the one who carried a message and lead a political soul or aspect of it. And there's argument. There is no Rasul woman, or another possibility, we don't know all the names of the prophets, we know this section of it, so maybe there was a female prophet. So that gives me an entry point about possibility. How can I imagine a possibility of this female prophet who nobody wrote about, who is invisible, who has not been heard about, it's not documented on archives. And similar to prophecy, there is the mirroring, coming from a religious country, always celestial and terrestrial mirror each other. If you're not having a validation on like a spirituality, you sort of, the society doesn't give you the validation in political realm as well. I was reading Fatima Mernissi talking about forgotten queens of Islam, how they didn't get the title of Khalifa. So it's all about title, who received that title, not meaning you haven't practiced it, but they didn't give you the title. So that was one question for me, where are the female prophets? But I didn't go back to archives. I looked around people around me. My mom, who I've been inspired by, my grandmother, who I've been inspired by, who she received these dreams, and she called us, and we were always afraid if she calls us what dream she had, and it always come true. So for me, I saw women with such a sensibility, eroticism of the spirituality, but I want to hear their story. I want to hear their journey. So that becomes an important part for me, to archive these journeys of them. What does this mysticism mean for them? How they enter it? Because they're very varied. And And not necessarily they know Ramli, they didn't know. And for me, it was interesting how this old divination, but it's still very systematic. I take the system and I define each figure, what it means through their knowledge. So that was the point I shifted, because the books that I was reading, they were very misogynistic as well, how they define it. So again, for me, was unpacking that as well and reach out to the knowledge of women around me to create this new understanding and knowledge for that.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting to me is that in a lot of ways, the practice looks kind of two ways. It anticipates this future that is extremely uncertain, that has so many elements of adversity and catastrophe sort of attached to it, but it also embarks on this project of opening up an entire genealogy of practice, an entire body of knowledge that's been carried forward through these vernacular ways in these different, in families, among groups of women sort of coming together to practice. So I kind of wanted to explore that question through these various iterations of your practice in these three shows at La Centrale, at the Art Gallery of Guelph, and at Articule. So to begin with La Centrale, because it was one of the earliest sort of iterations of this practice when you had started with performance and we're just sort of getting into 3D modeling and VR. You know, what kinds of questions were you navigating in that divination process? It was a collaboration with Morashine Al-Ayari. What kinds of questions were you looking at, and kind of, you know, how were you working with Morashine as well in that time to kind of create this collaborative body of knowledge?
Yeah, so first of all, like, I want to say how I wish Morashine was here as well. And we met through Nima, actually. Nima invited Morashine to our house, and she was already established. And for me, I just was in my MFA. So I was graduating, and she says, I need to work with you. And she shared her space with me. I want to say how important that is as an established artist, because usually when you're Iranian, like, they pick one of you, you know, like, not multiple Iranian women doing digital art, you know. She said, we need to share a space. And she was so, like, generous, and it was fascinating for me how that really helped me through my practice as well after that. So the catastrophe that we were facing, so if we say, like, each time I use methodology of Raml is because I want to navigate the methodology for me for my practice. Is that how do you, as you said, uncertainty, how do you make it work with that? So I use divination to map out my project, actually. So by that time, it was the Muslim ban happening. So my question from Raml was, what's the future that these borders hold? How body will cross? I did a divination, exact timing in the book. They said I do actually wuzu everything, and I felt like there are some beings around me. I was so scared, but I did it. And the figures that showed up, which are here in those plexiglasses, me and Morashine interpret them together. So again, I collaboratively we interpret them with what we understand. For example, if there is a house of fire and there is a shape of fire in it, then fire is in fire. How do you interpret that? What does it mean in the sense of what's the border holding in itself? So it becomes poetic, and she was the figure of Aisha Qandisha the Jinn, who cracks open at the back of men and bring catastrophe into their bodies. So she was that, and I was the female divinator who has not been in the history, basically. So I was this figure that I made it up, and the name, the mother of sand, Ilm-al-Raml, is one of the figure actually in Ramli, which has all the dots, which has like the maximum dots it can have, it has it. There is a father of Ram as well, which has 4 dots. The mother of Ram has 8 dots. So I keep that name and that title, and I became that gesture of poetic revealing those plexiglasses. Morashine was going to bring more personal stories and theoretical aspect of now how can we read that in a sense of what is border, what is catastrophe, how earth is uneven, how water is uneven, yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that you were saying when we were talking about this is that the way time gets interpreted through matter in this practice is very different from like this understanding of linear time, that, you know, things that are in sharper focus are more in the present, things that are less clear recede into the past. Can you expand on that a little bit? And especially in regard to kind of the sort of prophecy that you were able to sort of divine from the sand with regard to the specific question of borders.
Yeah, so what temporality in the books that I read is not like present, past, future. It defines itself as something blurry is future, sort of. Something which is weak and or dead is past, and something which is very accomplished and flourish and present is that. So it's not a linearity of it. And also, if we take those terms of past, future, present, the rhythm is like present, future, past, present, future, past. So there are 4 present fire, present earth, present air, present
Water.
Water, yeah. I mean, I did not in the correct order, but so that was interesting for me. Different possibilities, different path, and how to understand, because it's really, the divination is based on the science of sand. Matter is important on it. Also, what is also important, wet, dry, heat, coldness. So everything material comes in hand in order to read time, future, like how we interpret time, basically. Temporality becomes how you interpret it, which I try to play around with it in different ways in my project.
Yeah, and I think what was so interesting was the outcome you got out of like this idea of the future and the hope for the future as it pertains to borders, where it was such an unexpected kind of outcome too, right?
Yeah.
That actually, you explain it much better than I do.
It's like it's in this video, which is a documentation performance happening in Berlin, the floating university 2018. All the present doors was like fire and fire, catastrophe, move out, and then all the future was a bit calmer, but in a sense that you're dead. Like you die, you go on the ground, and you get salvation out from there. You know, like it was not a utopic, it was dystopic, but it holds in itself a future, which is quite interesting. In connection to catastrophe itself.
I mean, yeah, this idea that like if you become sublimated into the earth, it doesn't matter who draws a line on top of it, right? And as kind of morbid as that thought is, I think it also can be tremendously generative, right? And I think it's all of these kinds of unexpected permutations that we were really interested in exploring in our show at the Art Gallery of Guelph, right? We were addressing a pandemic context somewhat, but also kind of the cumulative weight of catastrophes, as Badura Lagra kind of talks about, that, you know, each kind of compounds on the other to create these kinds of forms of alienation, essentially, right? That sort of sever us from our networks of care, that sever us from our bodies, that sever us from the land. And this was one way of finding your way back. So with that work, it was mostly monitor-based work, right? And you were basically playing with 3D modeling in this very expansive way. And you were also documenting a history of a woman, of Ishq, practicing Ramali, and how she assembled a community of practice around her and created it through virtual space. And all of the possibilities that can exist. I wonder if you wanted to.
Yeah, so the work title is In the House of Fire with Awaz Ishq. Awaz Ishq was a person who I know in Toronto, attending mysticism classes, and they are at so another different generation as well. And they had a Facebook since 2011. She had a Facebook 2010 called Awaz Ishq. For me, it was interesting how she used Facebook, how she used virtual spaces and built community with this anonymous Venus, like the profile picture is already a flower.
Botticelli's Venus, yeah.
Yes. And it's always, all the post is like a poetry with an image of a nature, basically. So
like very like WhatsApp auntie kind of aesthetic. So
yes.
Yeah.
But for me, it was her connection to digital realm and using Facebook, because through that, she found people who immigrated to Canada, helped her to find her first house, find her to be in this part of mysticism classes. So it builds community through this. All of them have image of flower, in their profile, but like it really like make a community out of that. So I asked her, first of all, what was your journey since childhood? What was the first encounter of otherworldliness? We move on how she had a practice of dentistry. She was a professor at university, and I said, why do you use an anonymous name? I said, because people didn't expect me to talk about love when I am a dentist, when I'm a research-based person. So it was about how they all navigate between the balance of the two worlds of logic and what is the other side of logic. I say love rather than saying irrationality, but it's always the question of superstition. You become reduced to, you become, like derogatory term as soon as you talk about this poetry, stuff like that. So it's about her journey. So each monitor, one is present, one is future, one is past. Each monitor has all the 3D scan of the object was oriented around her, her books, her post in Facebook, her performance of reciting poetry, and at the end we hear her interpretation. I tell her you're in the house of fire, and the shape is soil and fire. How do you interpret that? And she wrote a very poetic text. Because the first question I asked, that was the divination was the facing, like, where are the female prophets? And I said, where are the female prophets? The first door tell me, don't go there. It's like fire is being closed down. I say, oh, Shirin, love is hard at the beginning. So it's like she read the poetry from Hafiz, actually. So each door has that combination.
And those poetic passages, they really invite the viewer to summon things from their body, their intuition, their sense of passion, a kind of sensuousness. I find it really interesting that you talk about the opposite of rationality being a form of love. And, we were talking last night about, like, kind of wrapping our heads around this concept of samah and Sufism, right? Mm-hmm. And this idea of, like, sublimating yourself into, like, a larger sort of project through this love for the divine. I don't know where I'm going with this now.
But like we were saying, like for me, it was not for, I wanted to hear, because they go to mysticism classes they read Maulana a lot. And I said, how do you understand it? I wanted to hear their personal connection and relation to this theory, and how actually, because they're devoted to that, how does it show itself in your everyday life? That's why I touch upon those personal stories so much, go around the narration. I'm not promoting it. I'm just hearing how they live it, basically. What's this embodied knowledge within them? And it's beautifully, because it's marriage of, there is Islam in it, but there's also another thing in it, her very, like, dentistry comes into it, like rationality, like everything, like, it's a mix that you cannot categorize, to be honest. It's either A or B. It's a mixture of everything in it.
And it's about conveying the complexity of that entire sort of world, right? And you each iteration of the work that I see, you build out that world a little further, right? Each of them, it starts with the video interviews where, you have the mask filter on them, which, maybe we should talk about that a little bit. But each single iteration, like that world where, also it's probably important to talk a little bit about 3D scanning as well here. Because a lot of the objects that are represented in your renderings, you've 3D scanned that are personal affects, right?
Yeah. I was inspired by Mauritian and her, the decolonization of digital, like, tools that we use. So for me, it was an entry point to now after this performance, I went to Banff and my first residency there, actually, and I 3D scanned my body to create this avatar of a female divinator with the mask on it. So I gave birth to it, because it's amazing the first time you 3D scan it appears suddenly, because I couldn't find any 3D model available, because they were always like not me. I needed to 3D scan, because I felt it didn't exist there. So 3D scan gives that ideal of give birth to things that are not in digital realm, or there is Islamophobia.
I remember becoming obsessed with, like, that entire 3D scanning process, because I think it happened over like 3 or 4 days, and you were like posting about it in your stories, and I was But, like, sorry.
So the mask that I'm using, the first thing was all these women said, I want to be anonymous. So I used the augmented reality mask, and the mask represents the divination doors, 16 doors. And in the middle it says Ilm, which means science. Usually when you want to do RAM, you put Ilm, and then you, like, map out everything else. So they wear that, and they were so, like, I'm so happy they accommodated that, because they always talk about myself is not myself. Like, my ego is not me. So they always, like, unpeeling themselves. So for me to show them in a way that it's not concrete, it's like very digital. With digital like equipment really helped me to actually do these interviews in a way that representing them in this ambiguity, fluidity they have actually. So there it comes the augmented reality mask, because of both the anonymity, but also how do you portray someone who wants to unpeel themselves constantly?
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's so interesting because with Avoze Eshk, it's sort of one person in their kind of expansive world, and it has this, at a certain point, it achieves this kind of consistency and coherence, but then with the Articule show, it multiplies, right? It becomes 4 women who are representing 4 different elements, 4 different houses, who are bringing very different kind of embodied knowledges to that space. And then you've then built out their worlds and then created this like machine, essentially, to kind of access these different levels of divination. So I wonder if you want to introduce us to like these 3 new characters besides Avasesh.
Yeah, so I chose 4 persons to interview, and so Avasesh was presenting the firehouses. The air was presented by North Wind Swallow, is it the bird? And then the water was presented by Rose, and the 4th one was by Mastane. So each gave the name that you liked, actually. I used that as on their title, basically. And access point at articule, if you go to see the show, the first one is towards the window. We see a very monumental image, very big print of them in a 3D, their 3D scan with the mask. And the objects that I 3D scanned, they brought an object that was important for them. So we see 4 big, large prints. And then you enter the space. There are 4 monitors, which each interview about their life journey towards mysticism. And showing the objects, it was meaningful for them. And then there is a fabrication in the middle, hexagon, which is a portal to access the VR headset. So the VR headset is very experimental for me. I started since January, and I'm so amazed by myself doing it. It's a hard process, and it takes time. But the idea was, how can I map all these 16 doors that we see flat as a panel in this exhibition? I give them each a house. Present house are the main level. For future, you go levels up. There's the steps to go to future. There are steps to go in the past. So we are in a desert, sort of non-time zone, and each house has a story and interpretation of each door, and the materiality of each women brought with themselves.
Yeah, and it's this like almost like kind of Borgesian like conceit where it's like expanding infinitely into these like recursive realities, and you've just kind of gotten started, right? It's like you're building them out little by little by little, and using kind of these practices of divination to be with these people in time, right? In time in its most expansive sense. Which I think, like we've also been kind of a little bit talking about this question of lineages, of inheritances, right? Because we've also been like personally navigating through like instances of loss as well. And this is what I found also incredibly compelling about this way of accessing, infinite pasts and sort of reaching towards infinite futures, is this idea that nothing is quite fixed, that there's all these kinds of layers, some of which are sometimes in conflict with each other, and you have to kind of actively work with each other in order to sort of not necessarily resolve, but come to terms with them, right? And I think that introduces this element of how you then take all of that knowledge and bring it to a viewer, right? This question of translation, of, how much do you maintain a certain degree of opacity in the work, which I think becomes a curatorial concern that both Mitra and I took up. How do we allow the practice its autonomy without sort of being, skewered by kind of default assumptions, by a certain kind of colonial gaze? How do you navigate those kinds of challenges in sort of constructing and creating the work?
So I want to first say the work predominantly is in Farsi, because I find I cannot produce this work in Farsi in Iran, so I cannot never show a whole Farsi speaking this type of work back in like Iran. But when I want to do it here, I have to always think how much they know about the Sufism, how much they know about all these cultural things I'm putting out there. So it's always a concern how much to show, how much to translate, how much to explain. All the interviews are done in Farsi, and with the help of Khashayar Mohammadi, they helped me to translate them in Farsi. But still, as a Farsi speaker, you feel there is certain things are untranslatable, obviously. But for me, digital technology of all these augmented reality, the imagery I create helped me through passing through that sort of default gaze that you said as well, because I feel I can give different entry points. You can only see it, maybe the image itself, and be like, oh, is this a female prophet? What is she saying to me? Or if you know a bit more about the knowledge of Sufism, some of the items can speak more to you. And the part of it also, the audience can go and search, like not to always over-explain. So I try to not over-explain the work, to give myself this freedom to work with this materiality the way I wish to work with. And I'm still balancing like how much to show and how much not to show. And the diagram, which is done by Sina Fakour, is a map in articule. There is a map, all in Farsi. It shows the whole map of the divination that we created together through the knowledge of these women. And so it's not something in the book, it's something created out of this. And that was just Farsi, and I didn't translate it, that one. So certain things are not translated, and because it was not, yeah.
Yeah, no, and I think like that's a choice that we also had to kind of work with in our show at Collective Offerings, where the only way to situate it, because also it's such a collaborative practice, we had to place every single work in dialogue, I think. And the only way to really situate it in that space was to put it in conversation with Shaista Latif's kind of installation in the middle of the room. This beautiful kind of blue and gold circular platform, 8 feet by 8 feet, with like a selection of objects arranged in the center, which then people had to come and sit down on and sit and ponder with these questions. Shaista's work lives very much within the material realm and conditions of labor, whereas yours gestures towards the metaphysical, but doesn't necessarily like completely sever itself from the material as well. It's a very material way of thinking through metaphysics. And so then it became its own system of knowledge that was in dynamic conversation, rather than something that could be like nailed down, made static, and then explained away through these kinds of Orientalist fallacies that we often bring when we look at work like this.
I would like to add, because as you said, I approach divination for facing uncertainty. I mean, historically, that's the whole divination is. You are in pain, you are in trouble, you want to say, is there any other possibility that I can exist and live in? And the Raml or divinator opens door for you, and you can either take it or just leave it. So again, me facing, that's why when I use divination, it's always unknownity with it, because my work comes out of the interpretation of those doors, and always a collaboration of who I'm talking in order to interpret each doors. So it always come in hand, and that uncertainty, that unknownity helps also to not have a default, understanding of it beforehand. So it always shaping during the process and with the collaboration.
Yeah, exactly. And I think like what we were hoping would happen from that kind of interaction between the works too is like, because Shaista's work asks very specific questions. For example, it asks, what would I be creating in a decolonized world? So then many of the questions you ask in the videos then become kind of about that, right? So there is this kind of interplay as well between these different forms of inquiry, and that like when you take the work out of that space, it then stops existing at that level, right? So I find that really interesting. And it's also really interesting that when we were talking about how you developed kind of 3D modeling skills and working with VR, you did it through you attended a workshop with Jawa Al-Khash, and she was like, well, I taught myself through YouTube videos, and it sort of opened a door for you.
Yeah, so it's always, I was fascinated by technologies, but always very inaccessible. Where is the workshop? Where is the money to attend those workshops? And for me, was seeing other people like Shirin or Jawal was like, oh, like YouTube. You can learn it from YouTube, but it takes more time. But as soon as you see people like you entering those doors, open those doors, it gives this like confidence to you as well. So I really, it amazed me, who I've been inspired by Jawal, by Shirin and others, and I wish more people use those sort of, to not feel afraid and there's a wall with you and, virtual reality, these things can be learned and you can spend time and like help each other as well. So that was very like community based.
Yeah, I was gonna bring up the term communities of practice and then like cringed immediately. But
you don't need to be, too close to each other. You open door and then leave.
But you are close to each other. I mean,
Yeah.
and like I think even this exhibition, like we've had to be kind of in proximity and kind of share space, whatever that means. And it really kind of emphasizes like, the importance of those communities of practice, right? In the same way that these women who are exploring divination are doing so in the space between orthodoxy and heterodoxy, between sort of Enlightenment views of rationalism and what is otherwise relegated to the realm of superstition. The only way they're able to sort of maintain the integrity of that body of knowledge is through this kind of assembling these communities and through these processes of exchange, kind of giving shape to these things that are otherwise so amorphous, right? And I found that to be incredibly compelling.
And since pandemic, because some of my interviews were done in Zoom as well, and their sessions were in Zoom as well, it was fascinating for me how this community actually exists in virtual sense, in online as well, and it didn't take away from them much. They do some of the sama needed to still be done physically, but certain things is still being conveyed through YouTube, Telegram, WhatsApp, and how they use those platforms as poetry, like very poetic. Reading poetry to each other and sending their voices to each other, and that's like beautiful.
I know it's gorgeous, but like I also can't relate at all. Like
It's hard.
But on that note, I think on this kind of effusive and hopeful note, I think we can end and open up the floor to questions, unless you.
Yes.
Yeah.
We can.
But we'll also let some of this land.